Hello and good evening. Welcome to this evening's webinar on the fundamentals of forage. I'm Tracey Hammond and my colleague Katie Reeve is also with us this evening and will be speaking as we go along. In this session, we're going to be covering the fundamentals of forage and in terms of what we're up to, we're going to be recording tonight's session and it will be posted on the YouTube channel at a later stage. We welcome questions from you this evening as we go through, but if you can just pop them in the Q&A box, because then if we don't catch up with everything tonight, then we can come back to you at a later date and answer your questions. So let's begin this evening's webinar. So when we got you to sign up to this webinar, you will notice that you completed a poll or some questions for us at that time. And with these questions, the reason that we asked them is we wanted to really know what mattered to you most with the current concerns about forage or forage supply. So with the questions that you've answered, we formulated this whole webinar evening and you provided us with some additional questions that we've included along the way as well. So at the top of the list, increasing costs of hay and haylage and running out of forage were your two main concerns. So they're the ones that I'm going to start off with this evening and cover and tell you a bit more about those. Just wait for my slides to catch up. So first and foremost, is there actually a forage shortage? You know, we've been hearing about this really all through the summer when the paddocks and fields were very bare and very dry because of a lack of rain, and certainly calls to the feed line indicate that there is a concern regarding forage shortages. In the mainstream media, we've also been hearing chatter about forage shortages as well. So a couple of programmes that I've seen and listened to, for example, Radio 4 Farming Today, earlier on in this month, they were looking at a special week of episodes looking at feed ingredients, and they did absolutely discuss forage shortages of grass, silage, hay and straw. Then I also watched Countryfile and Adam Henson. He was there in the field with his ewes and his lambs, discussing the problems that he'd had because he was very much in a bare field at that stage and he was utilising ewe nuts and silage that he would usually not use until the winter months, but he had to feed something because his animals were losing weight and condition. So there is definitely a bigger, wider concern regarding forage availability. Within our own team, colleagues that grow their own forage and some local farmers that I've spoken to here in Essex have typically reported about a third of the yield compared to last year on their own hay supplies. So certainly in Essex, which can be very dry in this part of the county, there is definitely some forage concerns. However, not everybody seems to be affected. So there does seem to be regional variations in grass forage availability, and some areas are okay, but some are not. So if you're in an area that's not affected, you're very lucky. Everybody will be coming looking for some of your forage this year, I suspect. So what are the consequences of kind of a forage shortage? I'm just waiting for my slide to catch up. So typically, we as horse owners rely on farmers for our conserved forage supply. But obviously farmers are in a situation that they now need to feed their animals first, and that's absolutely fair enough. But what this might mean for us, if you don't grow your own, is that there might be less forage choice. We may not be able to use the type of forage that we would usually feed. Overall, there may be less available for us to buy. So at some stage over the winter, it may be a bit more of a struggle to get hold of forage full stop. And sadly, lastly, prices definitely go up. So there are those three consequences there of potential forage shortages that we're likely to see. And to that end, when we're looking at the different forage sources that we have, we would like to know, and it clicks on, what conserved forage do you normally feed? So Katie is going to start a poll for me that I hope you don't mind answering. I'll just give you a second to do that.
Thanks, Tracey. That should be on the screen now. We've got some answers coming in.
Brilliant.
Got a lot of votes for hay so far, which I think is possibly not a surprise.
Yes. Apologies to anybody that's watching a recording of this. You won't be able to see or obviously participate in the polls themselves, but we'll give you some results in just a moment.
I think that's pretty nearly everybody. So we've got, yes, 82% going for hay and 47% going for haylage, couple feeding wrapped hay, and just under 20% using straw, which is great to hear as well. It's something that we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, I think.
Absolutely. And really those figures, Katie, they reflect what we see on the feed line, don't they? Because we monitor kind of on our feed advice forms what type of forage people are feeding. And generally every month it's hay that tends to be the most common type of forage that's fed. So that certainly reflects what we see.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. So in terms of the different forages that we have, what's going to happen if you can't get your usual hay supply? You may have to select something else. So when we're looking at different forages, there are differences between the types of forage that we have available to us, and it is useful to be aware of what some of those differences are in terms of making a selection that's most appropriate for your horse. So when we're looking at typical UK long-stemmed conserved forages, our choice tends to be from haylage, wrapped grass hay, and then cereal straw as well. And we'll have a look at the differences between some of those. So with regards to haylage, that tends to be cut at an earlier botanical age than hay would be, so prior to the seed head forming. And for that reason, the plant is a little bit less fibrous and should be a bit more digestible. So typically haylage will supply us with a slightly higher energy provision than comes from our other forage sources on the screen there. And for that reason, your grass haylages can be very useful in particular for perhaps our poorer doers and make more of a contribution to the ration of a working horse. We've got another category there of wrapped grass hay. Now, I don't think technically this exists as such, but it's something that we've been talking about because we are seeing a lot of haylages come in for analysis that are really too dry to be a haylage per se. Now, what the difference with that means is that sometimes the grass is cut a little bit later, and certainly the product itself is a lot drier. So it's more akin to hay than it is to haylage, but it's been wrapped in plastic. And that wrapping in plastic excludes the oxygen, which helps to preserve the crop, but we don't get the level of fermentation that you would see within a haylage or a true haylage, as we could call it. Now, what that means is that with haylage, because fermentation occurs that uses the sugars that are in the crop for the fermentation process, the level of water-soluble carbohydrates can be lower than hay. With a wrapped hay, where it's much drier, that fermentation can't occur, so that water-soluble carbohydrate isn't used up. So typically, the water-soluble carbohydrate levels are more akin to grass. When we move on to grass, it's a different preservation method. So rather than wrapping in plastic, we're removing moisture to preserve this particular crop by sun curing. So the hay has got to sit in the field for that little bit longer. And given the amount of sunshine and dry conditions that we had across this summer, that actually should have been quite favourable for farmers to produce a crop that's going to preserve well because it's dry. And certainly from the analysis that we've seen, the dry matters have been a bit higher this year than they usually would be. Because grass hay is cut at a later botanical age than haylage, it tends to be a little bit less digestible, but still more digestible than straw. So therefore the energy comes out at about 8 to 10 megajoules per kilogram of digestible energy on average, compared to those higher levels that you'd find in haylage. Now, something that we will pick up on later on is water-soluble carbohydrates. Those of you with laminitis-prone individuals will be more concerned about that. What I can say is that levels are kind of always highly variable, and they're going to be affected by many factors, including the grasses used, the weather conditions during growth, and also at the time of harvest. They're all going to have an impact on the water-soluble carbohydrate level. From the analysis that we've seen this year, the highest water-soluble carbohydrate level so far has been 20% and the lowest 10% on a dry matter basis. Now, for your laminitis prone individuals, you may have heard that you want to keep your forage to less than 10 to 12% non-structural carbohydrate. And non-structural carbohydrate is the sum of the water-soluble carbohydrate and starch added together. Now, starch tends to be very consistent in forages because the plants store sugar rather than starch. So typically we expect a starch level to be under 3% for certain, but the water-soluble carbohydrate is much more variable. Now, those figures there of between 20% and 10% of what we've seen so far, unfortunately, isn't based on very many samples. So I can't tell you what the average for this season is yet, but at the moment it's comparing kind of really to how it was last year. Some of the highest levels that we've seen in previous years have been up to 45% in some circumstances, which is an exception rather than the rule, but just to give you an idea of the levels that we might be seeing. Lastly on the list there, we've got cereal straw, and that's another option for us to feed. And again, that is stored by the removal of moisture by sun curing. It's the type of fibre that is very least digestible, as botanically it's very mature. So it's really low calorie, which for those of us with good doers can be really very useful for us. And you can utilise straw to dilute some of the other forages that you feed to lower the overall calorie intake of the ration. So you can replace up to 50% of the forage ration with straw based on current recommendations. Not only is straw low calorie, but it's also low water-soluble carbohydrate as well, which is good news again if we're trying to manage the good doer that's also laminitis prone, but obviously less useful for our performance horses and poor doers as it stands. There is undoubtedly differences in tastiness as well. Certainly horses find a good haylage very palatable indeed and can eat it with reasonable speed because they find it tasty. Whereas if we start mixing in straw to some of these other forage rations, it has been shown that it helps to slow the rate of intake of the entire forage ration, which is really beneficial, as we will discuss a bit later on. But what happens if you can't get any of these different types of forages? Then we may need to start considering other things as well. And this is where the Dengie range of fibre feeds can come in as an alternative as short chopped fibre feeds. Now within the range, we have all the products on the screen there that can be used as total forage replacers. So once these products have been introduced to your horse's diet gradually, potentially you can replace their normal forage ration in its entirety. We also have a number of other products within our range that may act as part forage replacers, which you can use in smaller quantities to extend your forage as well. So they are another option. So you'll see there's lots of different choices on the screen there. The highest calorie one is the pure grass pellets, and the lowest calorie one is the meadow light with herbs. So amongst those, it's a case of choosing one which largely is most appropriate for your horse and then considering it as an alternative. Now, with all of these options, if you are having to make a dietary change, plan to do it slowly if you can. So my advice this year is really don't leave it until the last minute, until you need to get something else. So don't reach the end of your forage supply before you're purchasing your next amount. So we want to make dietary changes really gradually because sudden diet change does increase the risk of digestive upset or disturbance. So that is something that we need to be aware of. So what we're generally aiming to do is to mix old and new kind of gradually, increasing kind of the new over a couple of weeks. So in terms of your kind of forage supply, if you can make sure you've got a good few weeks in hand, that will allow you to source your next lot of forage and also then to introduce it gradually if you do need to make a change. You'll also need to consider if you're switching between forages, so from a hay to a haylage or the other way around, then we are going to need to make adjustments in the quantity to account for the differences in dry matter. And that's something that Katie's going to pick up on shortly as well. One of the questions that we've already been having quite regularly over this summer, and also in the questions that came in ahead of this webinar, is when is it safe to feed this season's forage? So the general recommendation for wrapped forages is after 6 weeks, kind of post wrapping generally. What we need to happen there is for that fermentation process to occur and to be finished, and then for the product to be stable. And on the whole, that will take around 6 weeks or a little bit longer. With hay, it's a much quicker process. So what we need to happen with hay is we need to finish respiring. And providing that hay is of sufficient dry matter, then that process should actually happen really quite quickly. So as long as the hay is dry and there's no heating, then really we can start to introduce that straight away by gradually mixing it in with the previous supply. So a bit quicker with hay and a bit longer wait kind of with haylage. But some of you may already be using forage from this season's harvest at this stage. So the other thing that you were all worried about was managing costs. And I'm really sorry, I can't dress this up in any other way because costs are going up and there's not a lot that any of us can do about it. And that's with our horses' food and our own food as well. Really, the best that we can do is to try and reduce kind of waste. And really that comes down to storage. So in terms of preserving the forages that we have, we either need to keep moisture in the case of hay and straw out, or oxygen in the case of the wrapped forages out, to reduce mould risk. We don't want to be feeding mouldy forage to our horses. Certainly it's not any good for their general health, and they're very unlikely to find it tasty either. So that's definitely something that we want to avoid. So if you've got a leaky hay barn shed at the moment, now's definitely the time to be getting that fixed, because we don't want to lose valuable forage. And equally, if you're storing your haylage or your wrapped forage somewhere where there's access to birds or animals that can puncture holes in it, then we want to do all that we can to avoid that as well. The other thing that we can do is to monitor forage intake by weighing what's given and what's left over, with a view to reducing waste. Now, this is a habit that I would love every horse owner to get into anyway, regardless of the forage shortages, because monitoring your horse's forage intake can, if it starts to decline, give us an indication that there's either a problem with the forage or a problem with the horse. So a problem with the forage being something like mould, or a problem with the horse being something like dental problems, just to give you an example. So it's a really good habit to weigh what's offered and what's left over, and then over a period of time you can see how much is consumed. If you're consistently giving your horse, say, 12 kilograms of forage and they're only eating 10, then that's potentially 2 kilograms of forage every day that's going on the muck heap. So if you're managing to satisfy their appetite, just bring that quantity down in line a little bit more with what they are likely to eat, so that you can waste less. And as I say, my apologies, I can't dress that up any better than really reducing the waste. So we have another poll for you. So on the next poll, we're going to say, do you weigh your horse's conserved forage ration daily? And please be honest on this one. We would love to know.
Thanks, Tracey. That should be on everybody's screen now. We've got some results coming in. I think we're nearly getting there with everybody. Just leave it for a couple more minutes, but at the moment it's a lot of people have been very honest, which is great, and said no, they don't currently, but we have got a fair few of you saying yes you do, which is wonderful. So
that's great. I mean, from our perspective, knowing the weight of hay, if you're completing one of our feed advice forms, is so useful for us, because we can just check that you're feeding enough, that it's appropriate for your horse, and things like that. So if you can get into that habit, that is one that I would definitely recommend.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. So thanks, Tracey. I'm just going to come on to talk now a little bit about actually why forage is so important, when my screen catches up. There we go. So there's a few reasons why forage is so important for digestive health. I think a lot of you may already well be familiar with some of these. One of the first things, which I think is often that we maybe forget about, is that the horse's digestive system actually starts at the mouth. So chewing, the sort of the nature of the chopped or long-stemmed fibrous materials means that it's going to require much more chewing, greater intensity of chewing compared to things like mixes or cubes. And this means we get much more saliva production, which is really important for not only kind of lubricating the food as it passes through the digestive tract, but also to aid buffering of acidity further down, particularly in the stomach as well. So that becomes very important when we're talking in the context of gastric ulcers. As well as this, high fibre materials like forages can also create what's known as a fibrous mat in the stomach, and this can act as a bit of a physical barrier to acidity there. So this is one of the reasons why we do very much recommend feeding either a double handful or a stub scoop of a chopped fibre 20 or 30 minutes before exercise, just to help line the stomach and reduce that acid splash. So feeding plenty of forage, feeding plenty of hay absolutely sort of does a similar sort of job, but with that knowledge that actually a lot of us may be struggling with hay this winter, just using that sort of chopped fibre scoop before exercise can be really helpful as well. And then moving further down the digestive tract into the hindgut, fibre's got a really important role there in maintaining the health of the microbial population which live there. So these are millions of bugs whose job it is to ferment the fibre and break it down into a form that the horse can utilise. So we really want to be keeping these microbes very, very happy and healthy. They've got lots of important functions, so supporting vitamin production in the horse, keeping the horse warm, and also helping with their overall immune health as well. So we know that fibre and forage is really, really important. So it's just looking at ways that we can sort of assess how much we feed and also make sure we're feeding enough as well to support all of these functions. So a bit more practically, we often get asked how much forage should a horse eat and how much can they actually eat? And now these are two slightly different things. I'm sure any of you who have owned ponies in the past may have experienced them eating perhaps quite a lot more than maybe some of our horses might do. So I think we can say without a doubt that intake is quite individual and does vary a lot. Generally, we would expect a sort of upper appetite of around 2.5% of their body weight, but there have been some studies where ponies have been recorded to consume up to 5% in dry matter of their body weight, which is an enormous amount. So if we are feeding to appetite, which is what we often recommend, that could result in you getting through a lot more hay than you perhaps need to. Now, if we're dealing with a poor do or an underweight horse, yes, we do want to make sure we're feeding as much forage as we can. But certainly this year, I think that's maybe a luxury that not many of us will have for all of our horses. So as Tracey mentioned, ascertaining the horse's appetite by weighing what you're offering and weighing what's left is so important, just to help reduce that waste and make sure we're meeting their requirements, giving them enough to maintain their weight and their condition and support their digestive health, but perhaps not overdoing it, in particular for good doers, which Tracey will come on to a little bit later on. So when we talk about the minimum amount of forage that the horse needs, ideally we're aiming for a minimum on a long-term basis of 15 grams per kilogram of body weight. Now in some situations, as an absolute minimum, we might go to sort of 12.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, but this would generally be on a very short-term basis, always aiming to bring it back to that 15 grams per kilogram of body weight longer term. So this sort of equates to what you might have heard of the 1.5% of the horse's body weight on a dry matter basis. And this is important, I should say, this is the horse's current body weight. So if you're feeding an overweight horse, base it off their current body weight rather than their target body weight. So as an example, this would work out at around 7.5 kilograms for a 500 kilogram horse. Now, we do need to think about the dry matter content. So when we're weighing out our actual hay and putting it in its net, this would work out to 8.8 kilograms as fed. And I'll explain a little bit more about this now. So why do we use dry matter? Why are we always talking about on a dry matter basis? The reason for this is to give consistency, essentially, in our recommendations. So all forages will contain a natural level of moisture or water. So forages like grass will have quite a high water content. Haylage can be quite wet as well. We've all experienced that. But even hay would generally have a moisture or water content of around 15%. Now we can't see that. It looks like it feels like it's pretty dry, but it is sort of a natural moisture content in there that we do need to take into account. This moisture is basically diluting the amount of fibre and the other nutrients that are being supplied. So if we aren't accounting for this in our calculations, we could end up significantly underfeeding. So if you have a little look at the, I suppose, bar chart on the right of the top right of the screen there, you can just see the yellow represents the dry matter and the blue represents the water content, and you can see how it sort of compares. So a lot of people are sometimes surprised when we say we actually need to feed more haylage than hay on an as fed or by weight basis. And this is so that we can make sure the fibre intake for the horse is sufficient and it's not being diluted by all that extra water in the haylage. And if we don't have any analysis figures available, which is always the best option, so we know the exact dry matter content in our forages, but if we don't have that available, we do work off some sort of common averages. So usually we would say grass is around 20%, dry matter, haylage around 60%, and hay around 85% dry matter. But this will vary a little bit, and as Tracey mentioned, we are seeing more and more wrapped hays now, which will have dry matter content somewhere in between hay and haylage. So generally speaking, we would work out how much our horses need on a dry matter basis, and we would then convert it to our as fed quantities, so we know how much to weigh out when we're actually filling up our hay nets. So I popped the sort of calculations on the screen for if any of you are maths whizzes. You're welcome to take a screenshot of this if you sort of like to work it out. But alternatively, if maths is not your thing, feel free to contact us on the feed line if you'd like any help. We're more than happy to sort of work it out for you for your horse's body weight and the forage that you're using. But I'll just quickly whiz through it. So as I mentioned, we calculate the dry matter requirement first. So 1.5% of their body weight. So for a 500 kilogram horse, this would be 7.5 kilograms. And then if we're using hay or haylage, whichever forage we're using, to calculate our as fed amount, we would take that 1.5% of their body weight and we would divide it by the dry matter percentage of that forage. So if we've got a hay, which is around 85% dry matter, we would simply do 7.5 divided by 0.85 to give us 8.8 kilograms. And that's the amount that we would need to put in our hay net in order to achieve that 7.5 kilograms in dry matter. As I said, if you do have any problems at all, or if you're not confident in maths, then do let us know. We're very, very happy to help out with these. And we do also then get asked, what about grass? How do we add that into that calculation? So there are some simple sums that we can do where we'd maybe look at if the horse was on average grass. We can look at the sort of proportion of the day that they're out for and take that into account. But there's a lot of caveats there. There's a lot of variations in appetite for individuals, variations in the quality and availability of the grass. Stocking density can also affect it as well. So there's several different factors to take into account, and it will only be very much an estimate. What we are often asked is, how do we know if the horse has enough out there to eat, or how do I know if I should supplement with additional forage? And I think that the key thing is, if there's, if the grass is very poor, like we would maybe see in the winter, and there's really not very much, and the horses are stood around not eating anything, generally looking a bit miserable, you probably need to be putting some hay out there. What's quite a nice way to assess this, in particular at this time of year when we had that very, very dry period over the summer, and then in some parts of the country anyway, we had a period of rain, and I mean, my back garden was looking like the Serengeti a couple of weeks ago, and now the grass has grown like mad. So I'm sure sure there's a lot of you also in that situation in your horse's paddocks. We also have situations where the horse may be eating the grass as quickly as it's growing. So to us looking at it, doesn't look like there's much there, but they still might be getting something from it. So fencing off a little section that the horse can't get to is quite a nice way to actually assess that grass growth and see how quick it grows when it's not being eaten. Also looking at your horse's weight, are they losing weight, are they gaining weight, are they looking miserable, or are they seeming to spend a lot of time with their heads down eating, and looking at whether the number of droppings you're picking up is reducing or increasing indeed as well. These are all really good indicators to assess what you might need to change, or if anything needs changing in your horse's management. So I'm going to hand back over to Tracey now. She's just going to cover some concerns that some of you had about the forage perhaps being too good or too conditioning for your good doers or overweight horses.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. So absolutely, you were all definitely very concerned about this, but what came over loud and clear in the additional questions that we had alongside was that actually you were also very worried about laminitis. So I have tried to combine kind of both together here, but just be aware I could probably spend a good hour or so at least talking about kind of management of the laminitis prone individual. And if you haven't already seen our YouTube channel, there are lots of other webinar recordings on there specifically on the subject, and also the Nutrition Hub on our website has lots of information regarding conditions like equine metabolic syndrome as well. So if you haven't seen those and you'd like more information, please do head that way. So with regards to feeding the good doer and the laminitis prone individual, and I'm just waiting for the slide to catch up again. What do we do if the nutritional quality of your hay or haylage is just too good? So on the screen here really are my top tips, I suppose, in essence of what we're going to do. So we can soak the hay. We can mix straw through the hay or haylage ration. We can feed a low-calorie forage replacer, and in conjunction with all of the above, we need to try and make eating time last as long as possible. So they're kind of my top tips, or an overview of them. So when it comes to soaking hay, the main aim of doing this is that it will reduce the water-soluble carbohydrate level, because water-soluble carbohydrates get leached from the hay out into the water that we're soaking it in. And then also we're going to get a reduction of energy levels with the more water-soluble carbohydrates that we lose as well. But the results, I have to say, are highly variable. And also, if you have a horse with equine metabolic syndrome, their insulin response to the forage that they're consuming can also be highly variable as well. So although I gave you the advice earlier on of that 10 to 12% non-structural carbohydrate, which just as a reminder was water-soluble carbohydrate and starch added together, there are some individuals for which that will still perhaps be too high, and some that perhaps can cope just fine with a little bit higher. So it very much depends on your individual horse's response. Now, in terms of the research that has been done when it comes to soaking hay, there has been, a reasonable amount, but nothing kind of consistent, I would say. So what that means is when you have a look online, you will probably come across lots of different recommendations for soaking hay. In terms of the research that's out there, the general message that has come from the available studies is that warmer water will result in greater losses of water-soluble carbohydrate. A larger volume of water that you soak your hay in, again, will result in greater losses, and then longer soak times will also result in greater losses. So if we can have warm water, a big volume of water, and a long soak time, then the chances are we are going to get kind of bigger losses of water-soluble carbohydrates, which can be useful for the weight management and the laminitis side of things as well. Again, you are likely to see lots of different recommendations with regards to soak times, and this is going to be highly individual. These aren't the law, they are just guidelines that you can follow. So between us nutritionists here at Dengie, kind of our recommendations tend to be through the day or night, up to 12 hours in cooler conditions, but perhaps less time, so a couple of hours when it's really hot. The reason being is that the kind of longer that we soak for, especially in very hot conditions, then potentially the more the microbial load of that forage, so it's less hygienic quality. We don't really know the consequences of that yet. And again, this may depend on whether you can perhaps soak your forage and then change the water and soak it again, in which case you can increase it for longer, but they are just the guidelines that are in existence. You've already been putting some fantastic questions in the Q&A section. And one of the questions I saw pop up a little while ago was with regards to dry matter losses when you soak hay. And that's quite right. When we soak for very long periods of time, we do get an increase in the dry matter losses. So if you are soaking for very long periods of time, so that 12 hours period, then what we would recommend is rather than that 1.5% of body weight being a minimum, we would increase that to 1.8% of body weight, just to make sure that we're still meeting those particular forage requirements. And obviously it's not just energy and water soluble carbohydrates that you'll lose. There will be other nutrients that we lose, and again we will pick up with that as we go along. But when it comes to soaking hay, there are some downsides or challenges that we do need to think about and perhaps be prepared for, especially over the winter months. So if you do need to soak your hay because it's very good, is that something that you can realistically sustain and keep doing? I mean, if you can, that's great. But the things that we do need to think about is water certainly is a precious resource. Obviously over the summer that we've just had, there were hosepipe bans that made it, more tricky for people to soak their forage. And in fact, some yards that we come across don't even allow horse owners to soak their forage kind of anymore in terms of preserving water. So we do need to consider whether that's practical for your individual circumstance. As we come through the winter months, obviously we're going to get frozen taps, frozen water buckets, and also frozen yards in the winter time. I did have a pony that had both EMS and PPID, and I used to soak her forage, so I'm well used to being in this position as well. And I wasn't very popular. On the one occasion I accidentally turned the yard into an ice rink when I always tried to take the water away elsewhere. The other thing that we need to think about is time. So if you are on your own yard and you don't have anybody to support you in looking after your horse, and you may work full time, then can you actually kind of get the hay soaked? Is it practical for you to do? So they're all the kind of challenges that we may face when we're feeding kind of soaked hay. So we may need to think about a backup plan and a little bit of an alternative. And this is where kind of straw can come in really handy. As I said, it's much lower calorie or energy than hay is, and also it's lower in water soluble carbohydrates, so it can be really useful for that reason. And again, another question came in on the Q&A that I saw, which was about whether if there was a specific type of straw that we could be using. So in the Dengie feeds, just to let you know, we use predominantly oat straw, but also wheat straw as well to maintain our supply. But barley straw is also another straw that you can use too. So wheat, barley and oat straw can all be used for your horse, providing these following caveats. So the first thing that we want to make sure is that your horse has good teeth. They need those good teeth to be able to grind that straw down into small particles and for their digestive system to then cope with it. We absolutely want to introduce it very gradually to allow time for the digestive system to adapt. So one of the pushbacks that I often get when I'm recommending straw for horse owners is the concern with regards to impaction colic risk. And that risk would be greatest if we suddenly had a straw horse that was going from having no straw to a lot of straw at once. So the classic example of a horse transferring onto a straw bed, eating all of its bed and then getting impaction colic. So we definitely don't want that to happen. So we need to introduce very gradually. And also to allow free access to water and make sure the horse is drinking plenty again, because when the horse comes into the stable, particularly over the winter and it gets a bit colder, then they may not always be as keen to drink, especially the older horses and ponies. So we want to make sure that they're drinking to keep their gut contents nice and hydrated as well. And there is another caveat that I've left off there, but obviously the forage, as with any forage, should be free from mold. So we don't want it forage that's looking kind of grey and smelling disgusting. that's not going to be consumed and it's not healthy for your horse to eat. So we do need to make sure that that straw is of good hygienic quality as well. When it comes to straw feeding, really the main benefit of it is it allows a greater amount of forage to be fed, which will help to maintain your horse's eating time whilst reducing their energy intake. So whilst we have discussed minimum forage amounts for horses, we really want to be doing everything that we absolutely can for these good doers to feed them as much forage as possible because it's most beneficial for their welfare. So we want to try and maintain that intake. And the only way that we can do that is by feeding a forage that is low enough in calories in order to do it. So there has been some research there that you can see on the screen that feeding up to 50% of the forage ration straw is acceptable and doesn't increase the risk of equine gastric ulcer syndrome. So there was some early research that was an epidemiological study that seemed to suggest straw feeding increased the risk of gastric ulcers, but it wasn't entirely clear in that study what other forage sources those horses were having access to and whether they were even kind of eating the straw itself. So this follow-up study was really, really interesting and didn't find any problems by replacing 50% of the haylage ration with straw. And although it was only a small study and it's a number of one, the timing of the study, the duration it was for, that was sufficient to indicate if there were going to be gastric ulcers, they probably would have occurred in that time. And, for years we've been arguing here, what's better, having a horse that's spending much more time chewing by utilising straw or feeding other fibre sources that are considered more beneficial. And we'd always argue that more chew time is definitely going to be better. The other thing that this study found was the use of straw slowed the rate of eating so significantly that the insulin response was negligible. Now that's really good news for those horses with EMS because that's precisely what we want to be doing. We want to be reducing their insulin response in relation to feeding. So mixing straw through your usual forage ration can be really useful to slow the rate of intake down considerably as well. So if it is something that you have available to you and can use, then I would recommend giving it a try. And just to show you what this looks like kind of in practice, here at Dengie we use a ration evaluation program called PC Horse, where we can put in all of the details about the horse and about the forage that they're consuming, and then it does the sums for us, so we don't have to dust off our calculators in this instance. So using just a standard meadow hay that comes as part of the package of the programme, fed at 1.5% of the body weight on a dry matter basis, you can see what nutrients that ration is supplying and what nutrients that ration is lacking in. So anything in red is being supplied at less than optimal requirements. In this instance, firstly, what we're really interested in is energy. So we are still largely meeting the horse's energy requirements with this average hay, even though we've restricted the amount fed. So this kind of quantity may still not be successful for weight loss, and we don't want to reduce the quantities anymore. But if we add straw into a 50-50 ratio, again feeding at 1.5% of the body weight on a dry matter basis, then you will see a different picture. Oh, one too many. Come back. So with this picture, first of all, can you see already how much more is in red? And this is just something that I also want to highlight for you. Starting with the energy side of things, the energy intake is reduced to 78% of the horse's energy requirements. So it does really make a significant calorie reduction. So we would expect weight loss on that ration, but hopefully what we will be able to do is to feed that horse more forage and still get the weight loss rather than restricting it to that 1.5%. As I say, though, you can see that there are now a lot more nutrients that are in red that were previously in green. And I would just like to remind everybody that forage alone in the first place doesn't provide your horse with everything that they need for a balanced diet. And if we have to start soaking our forage or utilising more forage as part of the horse's forage, utilising more straw as part of the horse's forage ration, then there are going to be more nutrients that we are missing out on. Very easy way to rectify that is to consider adding a feed balancer as part of the bucket feed, which won't then provide too many additional calories, but just something to think about. If you can't get straw, which might be a possibility. It seems to be, tricky to get hold of in some areas. Then you can obviously use low-calorie forage replacer alternatives as well. So again, our low-calorie products are there on the screen, with the absolute lowest calorie one being the Meadow Light with herbs, which is predominantly a chopped straw-based feed. So there are other alternatives if you can't get what you would ideally like to get in the first place. As I said, with all of these things, whatever forage we're feeding, our main aim is to slow the rate of intake. Not only will that help us to keep our horses occupied for longer, but also hopefully we'll then be able to reduce that insulin response to whatever the horse is eating as well. And you've probably all seen lots of different slow feeding devices that we're now lucky enough to have available for use. And there is, again, in the literature, there is some evidence that they do slow the rate of intake to some degree. The most recent research at the bottom there that I particularly liked, because it seemed to suggest that filling your hay nets partially full rather than completely stuffed was the most effective tool to increase feeding consumption time compared to feeding on the ground, fully filled hay nets and a slow feeder hay box that the researchers made themselves. Now, with this study, I have to say it was in ponies, specifically Shetland types and also Welsh types as well. So we can't necessarily translate it to the horse, but there was lots of other things that they were considering in this study, like how the horse was actually biting the forage, what effect that may then have on their posture and things like that as well. But certainly in terms of increasing eating time, those partially filled nets were a very effective tool. And what they meant kind of by partially filled in this instance is in the normal full net hay nets that they had, they'd have 3 kilograms of forage in them, and in the partially filled ones it was only 1 kilogram, so it was about a third of the amount. And as I say, it's just something very simple that we can do. We don't know how effective that is yet in horses, but it's something that if we do use hay nets, it's something that we can try. And actually, that's my own horse there who I used to have in the bottom picture. And incidentally, that's something that I tried with her when she was stabled all the time. I'd separate her forage up into multiple nets, as you could see there. She'd have a little bit on the floor, and in that photo, she's having a treat ball as well, which has got some alfalfa pellets in there. So it's just about doing all that we can to keep our horses occupied, and if they're good doers, trying to slow their rate of intake quite significantly as well. The last thing that I'd like to discuss before Katie takes over again is that grass still provides nutrition in winter. Time and again, we seem to come across this presumption that winter grass provides nothing. It's just chew time, there's nothing to it whatsoever. And unfortunately, that is definitely not the truth. With environmental changes, we are definitely seeing some milder winters. Under those circumstances, if it's mild enough, then grass can still continue to grow over the winter. And this means that in order to keep our horses at a healthy weight, we may still need to be implementing grazing restrictions through the autumn and winter to encourage weight loss. We also need to still consider laminitis risk, and if you are managing a laminitis prone individual, you'll know that it is a lifelong commitment, and in some circumstances no turnout is the most appropriate option, in which case we're relying on our conserved forages instead. But just again to reiterate that winter grazing can indeed provide plenty of calories. What we don't want to see is our good doers coming out of winter fatter than they went into winter, because then they would just gain more weight come spring or summer. So it's something that we need to be aware of. And transferring back to Katie, she's going to talk about managing senior horses or those with dental problems, as that was another concern that we were seeing quite regularly as well.
Lovely, thank you very much, Tracey. So I'll move on now. So what I first just wanted to talk in a little bit of detail about, because I think it's something that we do sort of find ourselves coming back to, was a study that we were involved with Rittle College a few years back. It wasn't published, but the results were really quite interesting, and I definitely thought it was something to talk about. So it was aiming to look at actually how much of an impact does poor dentition have on older horses, and the amount that they can eat, because it's something that we were hearing a lot, and we still continue to hear a lot about on our feed line and when speaking to horse owners as well. So what was done in the study was they compared horses with poor dentition and those with normal or healthy dentition. And they looked at these horses' ability to consume 3 different types of forage in a 45-minute time frame. So literally how much they were sort of eating of the different forage types. So the first one was hay. The second one was a short chopped fibre or a chaff, so a dried grass and alfalfa blend. And then the third option was a fully soaked option, so it was a hay and sugar beet combination. So when it came to the results, they found that in the horses who had the poor teeth, they refused hay on 44% of occasions. So something that we do find for older horses who are starting to struggle with their teeth, actually a change in appetite or a lack of enthusiasm for their hay is often the first sign that we see when they are starting to feel a little bit uncomfortable in their mouth. In contrast, so this same group of horses, only 6% of the time did they struggle with a short chopped fibre. So that goes to show that these short chops can be really beneficial ways to up fibre intake or to top up the fibre intake in horses with poor dentition. But unfortunately, this wasn't always an option for all of the horses, and for all of the horses, they were able to manage and enjoy the soaked option. In this instance, the product was used was Dengie Alpha Beet. So it's a really nice choice to sort of look at for horses who do have poorer dentition if they can really no longer manage a short chopped fibre. So the main thing that we'll be looking at is if these horses are struggling, if you do have a horse who's maybe not able to eat as much hay as they perhaps once did, it's all about coming up with finding these alternative options. So for those who are starting to struggle with their teeth and maybe not eating as much hay, in many cases they can still manage pasture, and they can keep going with this for a little bit longer than hay, generally speaking. We do need to take into account any other concerns here, though, for example, those with laminitis. As Tracey mentioned, pasture turnout might not always be an appropriate choice. And we are also seeing additional dental problems, sometimes occurring in younger horses as well, such as EOTRH or equine odontoclastic tooth resorption and hypercementosis. This is something we are sadly seeing more and more of, and this basically affects their front teeth and their ability to bite on the shorter grass. So for these individuals, pasture still might not be the right solution. So for horses who can manage to chew to some degree, a short chopped fibre is always a good place to start. Ideally, we want to be keeping these horses chewing for as long as possible rather than going immediately to a fully soaked ration. The reason for this, as I mentioned earlier, that chew time can be really important for helping to produce saliva and helping to provide some additional buffering within the digestive tract. So if we can keep them chewing for as long as we can, whether that's then going to a shorter chop before we move on to a fully soaked option, that's always a good way to do it. Tracey's mentioned a couple of the products within the Dengie range, but chopped fibres, including alfalfa, grass and straw, can be a really useful option depending on your individual horse's calorie or energy requirements. Some for those horses who are still who do still struggle with the short chops and that's still not an option for them, we can then look to move on to a fully soaked mash type product. So things like grass pellets, alfalfa pellets, or unmolashed sugar beet can be really valuable choices here. And now, when it comes to making these chopped fibre feeds or the soaked forage replacements last longer, this is something which I think is actually quite high on in people's minds at the moment. I was at Blenheim last week on the Dengie stand, and we had an awful lot of inquiries about this. So it's something I did want to touch on today. So similarly to what Tracey mentioned with regard to slowing down the chew time and making your hay or your forage ration last longer, we want to be dividing our forage replacement feeds into as many small meals as possible. So dividing them up into, rather than just a breakfast and a dinner, try and see if you can get some more in during the day, perhaps make up a bucket, and if you've got a friend on the yard, ask them to pop it in later in the evening, so that they've got something later at night to keep them going, especially if you are using a mash feed that really doesn't require very much chewing at all. The chances are they're going to eat it pretty quick, so the later we can feed it overnight, the better. If this is more challenging, splitting it even into multiple buckets in the stable can also help to slow them down. So rather than just one big bucket that they can just stand with their head in, try and split it into smaller buckets and just spread it around the stable or the paddock if they're out, so that they have to move around a little bit and go between them. Using wide bottom buckets can also help, and also putting things like footballs or very, very large smooth stones or pebbles in the bucket can help to slow them down, as well as they have to sort of move these out the way to pick around these. There are also a range of slow feeding devices or tools that we can use nowadays as well, which help with this. Now I could, as Tracey mentioned with laminitis, I could probably talk about dental problems and forage replacers all night as well. So just sort of touching on that, but now moving on to the next question that we had, which does tie in really, and that those of you who are worried about actually struggling to feed enough forage for poor doers or underweight horses over the winter, which I think is a really, really valid concern, because we talk a lot about good doers and giving them the minimum amount of forage, but actually what do we do for those who would normally have ad lib hay, who maybe that's more of a challenge for them this year. And also for those of you who may be in the situation where we haven't got quite as much choice of the hay that we would normally buy, and we may end up with a forage which is of slightly lower nutritional value, and what do we do in those situations? So before I sort of go into too much detail from the forage side of things, I did just want to mention, if you do have a horse who's a poor doer or underweight, really ensuring that we are looking at the reasons for this. And for those who maybe tend to lose weight over winter, you might have noticed they've started to drop off a little bit earlier this year, particularly if they've been on a bare paddock all summer. They may have lost weight more quickly than they would normally have done, and possibly taken us a little bit by surprise in that case. Making sure they're eating enough forage. So as we mentioned, weighing out your forage is really, really important here. I think we possibly can't emphasize this enough. Making sure that they are eating that minimum quantity of forage, and if they're not, is there a reason for that? So are there any dental problems? Is there something wrong with the hay? And if all of these things are okay, maybe then looking at some alternative forages which may be more tasty, or maybe a forage replacement options like some of the ones that we've just spoken about. And if they are still in work, or if they usually have a bucket feed, making sure they're having the right amount of it at the recommended quantity as well. So if you're underfeeding the bucket feed, or if you're using a very low energy bucket feed, you might be able to save yourself some pennies by finding a bucket feed which can be fed at which is more calorie dense, so you can feed the correct quantity and get more calories per scoop. So from the fibre side of things, using things like alfalfa can be really beneficial, but I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. And also looking at any underlying health problems. I think a common misconception is actually just because a horse is old, it doesn't mean they have to be thin. So getting to the bottom of the reason, even if it's an older horse, are there any problems which are causing that? And if there's nothing obvious, have a chat with your vet. Is there anything else that's going on underlying? So essentially, we just want to make sure we're getting enough energy going in, or calories going in, and help them with maintaining that weight and condition over winter. And we do often also get asked about the amount of energy that a forage is supplying. And this is going to be very much dependent on its digestibility. So Tracey touched on this a little bit earlier. This can be very much affected by factors like the source of the forage, the type of the forage, and also how mature it is when the plant was harvested. So if we think back to our days of biology back at school, we know that the cell walls of a plant include their structural carbohydrates, their cellulose, hemicellulose, as well as things like lignin. And it's these which give the plants their structure to basically hold them upright. And as the plant gets taller, it's going to need more structure to hold it up. And so these levels of these structural carbohydrates will increase. Now, these are less digestible for the horse. So if the plant is harvested later on, we've got more structural carbohydrates and it's harder for the horse to break them down. And this means they're not going to be able to extract as much energy from these forages. In contrast, when we're looking at plants of a younger botanical age, so those which have been harvested when they're less mature, these will have lower levels of these structural carbohydrates, and so it'll be much easier for the horse to break them down and digest. So in practical terms, if we think about our forages for poor doers, if we can choose forages which are softer, leafier, cut earlier in the season when the plant's a bit younger, these are generally going to be more digestible for the horse, and they'll be able to extract more energy or more calories from them. Our later cut, our coarser forages will be more mature when they've been cut, so they'll have less energy available to the horse. So if you are in the position that you are able to, you've got a few options of the forage that you source for your horse this winter, and you have a poor doer or an underweight horse, try and look for a forage which is a little bit softer and leafier, and cut a little bit earlier on. Hopefully they'll be able to get more benefit from them, and your forage will go a bit further. And then when it comes to the different types of fibre in the horse's diet as a whole, or in their bucket feed, we've got lots of different high fibre materials available to us. As I mentioned, generally forages that are cut later will be less easily digestible and have a lower energy available to the horse. In contrast, ingredients like sugar beet pulp, these are very, very easily digestible for the horse. They're much better at breaking this down. Sugar beet actually grows underground, so it doesn't need that high level of indigestible fibre to hold it upright above the ground. So that's one of the reasons why it's so super digestible for the horse. We also have alfalfa, which in this country is typically cut earlier in the season, which means that it's, again, more digestible for the horse. It's less mature, easier for them to break down. At Dengie, we dry our alfalfa. We use a method called precision drying, where we dry at very high temperatures, rather than being sun-dried in field like hay would be, and this means we can cut it at a younger age and really sort of lock in those nutrients and keep it nice and digestible for the horse. So these more digestible fibre types, like our sugar beet pulp and our alfalfa, can make a much more significant contribution to the energy or the calorie requirements for those horses who do need a bit more support to maintain their weight and condition. They're still high fibre materials, so they're really great for their health and their well-being and their digestive support. And if we need more energy or more calories, we can use feeds like alfalfa with added oil as another really good way just to boost our calorie intake. And the other benefit with our high fibre materials is that they're low in sugar and starch, so really good for providing that slow release energy, which we're sort of looking for to support horses either in work or at rest. And then we've spoken a bit about slowing our horses down, but what about the other end of the scale, where for those horses who perhaps have a limited forage appetite? So again, this comes back to weighing our forage, monitoring how much they're eating. If you notice that your horses are not eating as much forage as they once did, whether that's just a slight drop in the quantity or whether they're backing off it and not eating it at all, one of the first things that we should do is just make sure there's not a problem with the hay. So make sure we've not got any evidence of mold or dust. Looking at, is it just one horse who stopped eating it, or is it multiple horses on the yard who've backed off? If it's a new batch of hay or a new supply, that can be an indication if this corresponds with a change in appetite. It could represent a problem with our forage rather than a problem with our horse. The other thing that we can look at if our horses are lacking an appetite for their forage is dental health. As I mentioned, this is one of the big ones, and something which we hear a lot is a lot of people saying, well, my horse's teeth are good for their age. But good for their age doesn't always translate to good teeth. It could be, even if a horse is very old and their teeth are not good, it could still mean they're not eating enough forage. So we need to maybe just check our definitions of that if we're told by our vets that they're good for their age. So in these situations, alternatives may be needed, but it's not just the teeth, so also other things like things that cause discomfort, so perhaps arthritis in the jaw or any other musculoskeletal issues that could perhaps be affecting the horse's comfort when they're chewing. Problems in the head, back or neck could also be affecting their appetite as well, so do just bear in mind whether those may be a concern for your horse. One thing I often recommend in these situations is trying feeding forage from different locations. So if your horse normally has their hay in a small hold net, try popping it either on the floor or in a big bin, and see if they're more inclined to eat it that way. It could be more comfortable for them to chew, and they may be more inclined to eat up. Or for those of you who maybe have horses who are quite nosy and like to watch what's going on outside their stable, and you normally put their hay net tied up in the back corner, try popping it near the front door so they can still watch the world go past and eat their hay at the same time. And if we're still not having any joy, we can look at different forage sources, so maybe some which are a bit more palatable. Now, we might not have this choice this year, but if you can mix it with different forages, so if you have haylage available on the yard as well as hay, trying to combine them and see if that could be helpful. You could also try separate buckets of alternative fibre feeds like beet pulp or chopped fibres, just to spark their interest and hopefully get them going again with eating. And as we've said, weighing how much you're providing is without a doubt very, very important. So what about if we can only source this less nutritious forage, which I think is without a doubt is going to be a concern for a lot of us this year. So in these situations, topping up our forage supply with higher calorie fibre sources can be a good place to start. And this just gives you a little bit more of an element of control here. So things like chopped and pelleted grasses, alfalfas, as I mentioned, can be really useful, and unmolasses sugar beet pulp as well, all high fibre materials which are perfect for topping up your horse's hay supply, whether you've got a short supply or whether your forage just isn't good enough. These are great options to provide a few more fibre-based calories. Now, the feeding rates of these products will vary a little bit depending on the type of product. So they can range from 500 grams per 100 kilograms of body weight, all the way up to feeding to appetite or ad lib quantities. So do just double check with us if there are any products that you're specifically interested in. So that brings us just to sort of final slide here. Where can we get further information? So as Tracey's mentioned, we do have lots of webinar recordings from the past on our YouTube channel, so do check those out. We've also got our nutrition hub on our website, which was only launched about 6 months ago now, I think. We've got lots and lots of articles on there on a range of different topics. And you can also contact our nutrition team, which comprises of Tracey and myself and also some other fantastic team members. We're more than happy to offer feed advice and nutrition support, not just about Dengie products, but about all areas of your horse's feed and forage as well. So the details are on the screen there, and you can also fill out a feed advice form on our website as well. So we've got had some questions that have come in. We've had some questions, I think, coming in on the chat and the Q&A throughout, but we've had some that came in previously as well. So we'll just kick off with those. And if anybody does have any questions, do feel free to pop them on the in the Q&A box. So Tracey, I'll start with one for you. One of the questions we had are, what are the potential impacts of a reduced time spent grazing, in particular for ulcer-prone horses, and especially this year when we've had much barer paddocks?
Yeah, thank you, Katie. That's something, again, that we've been questioned quite a bit about over the summer months with poor kind of grazing availability, whether people should be supplementing. And as Katie discussed through her section of the webinar, we definitely want to be monitoring the horse's behaviour and how much is out there as to whether they're really getting sufficient. Ultimately, the risk for these horses, where there is very little in the paddock, is potentially a greater risk of ulcers. And actually, there was a study published earlier this year looking at ulcers in Icelandic horses, as it happens, that were actually maintained outside 24/7 all year round across the course of a year. And the researchers were looking at particular risk factors for gastric ulcers. And when it came to equine squamous gastric disease, which is the ulcers that are at the top of the horse's stomach, one of the risks they very much identified was a reduction in grass availability with no additional forage increased the risk of ulcers in that part of the horse's stomach. And really their conclusions, to that were that perhaps forage wasn't being introduced quickly enough to those horses that had less of a supply, and that starting to introduce small amounts of forage earlier may potentially have a protective effect when it comes to ulcers. Unfortunately, what I don't know yet, and what I can't say from the available research, would be what the optimal of height of the grass would be, because even within this study, they were kind of describing 3 different lengths of grass, and it wasn't necessarily the lowest length of grass that was giving the problem. So we don't have that information yet. But based on what we do know, as we say, monitor your horse's behaviour when they can't see you. What are they doing? Are they head down grazing? Or are they stood looking kind of miserable? And to that end, monitoring things like droppings as well can tell us about the amount of forage going through. So we want to maintain that trickle of forage going through the digestive tract and that chew time to give us the greatest support for the horse's stomach health. If you've got a good doer, obviously, as we've already said, then that's going to have to be lower calorie forages. And if you've got more of a poor doer, then that may be a higher calorie forage instead. Okay, so one for you, Katie, I think is the next one, probably follows on quite well for that. I think you answered the one about how much energy does fibre provide. So I'm going to skip to the next one, which is how can I learn more about the science of feeding and keep up to date with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tracey. So I think there's a lot of information these days about feeding. There's, everywhere you look, we've got, especially with social media kind of going crazy as well, it can sometimes be hard to know actually what information you can trust and sort of what you can look out for. There is actually a new initiative which is just in the process of being launched from beta, which is the NFAR scheme, which will be a really nice way of sort of identifying qualified nutritionists to get information from. So watch this space. We'll hopefully have more information on that to share soon. But from the point of view of us here at Dengie, we really do our best to keep up to date with all the latest research. So we're very, very fortunate we're able to attend a lot of the major nutrition conferences, both in the UK and across the world as well. And we do regularly review kind of all the latest research that does come out. As I mentioned, we've got the Nutrition Hub on our website, which is, it's brand new, so it's very up to date. And we will be updating all of these articles periodically when there is any new research available to share. So if there's a topic you're particularly interested in, do keep an eye on there. And keep a lookout for our webinars as well. We'll always make sure these are sort of up to date and we are including the latest findings. Fab. So Tracey, the next question I have for you is somebody's said, I currently feed my good doer your healthy hooves molasses free. Shall I up the quantity that my horse is having when the forage is in short supply?
Okay, perfect. So a bit of a mixed answer to this one. So if your forage is in short supply and you aren't feeding the recommended amount of healthy hooves molasses free and you just want to extend your forage supply a little bit, then absolutely the first thing that you could do is increase up to the recommended quantity, which is 500 grams or 1 stump scoop per 100 kilograms of your horse's body weight. And that way you will also be providing a balanced diet, because this feed is fortified with added vitamins and minerals. So you can feed it up to that level. But if you are needing to feed something at a higher quantity because your forage is in really short supply, then I would advise choosing one of our other kind of chopped, low calorie chopped fibre feeds that doesn't have the vitamins and minerals added to it to feed on top. So your Meadow Light, your Ulcer Light, for example, could be other molasses-free alternatives.
Thanks, Tracey.
Excellent. So I've got another one for you, Katie, here. This is a good one. It's has the alfalfa crop suffered this year? I've had a few questions on that.
We have, and you know what? I had a few people asking me this at Blenheim as well. Very concerned they wouldn't be able to get their Alpha A this year. But to put all of your minds at ease, we are all good on the alfalfa front. As some of you may know, we do grow our own alfalfa in the UK in Essex. So the name Dengie of our company actually comes from the area where we grow it on the Dengie Peninsula. This is actually naturally quite a dry part of the UK anyway, and this works really well for alfalfa growth because alfalfa is quite a drought resistant crop, and we do actually really work with these extended dry periods every year to try and get our harvest in and get a good yield. So I think we could probably say a little bit of rain wouldn't have gone amiss this year, but please do be assured we've got plenty of alfalfa. We're not expecting any shortages here, such as those that may be seen with the hay.
Perfect. Katie?
So next question for you, Tracey. We've sort of answered it a little bit already, but I didn't know if you wanted to elaborate any further, or I suppose what would be your most commonly recommended either partial or full forage replacer from the Dengie range? What's your go-to?
Absolutely. So they were the ones that were all on the screen earlier on in my presentation. The one at the moment that I seem to be recommending a lot is the Meadow Light with herbs, just because we are getting so many inquiries about overweight horses and those with equine metabolic syndrome. So as I say, we're doing all that we can to try and promote as much chew time and as much forage intake as possible. So it's really practical from that perspective, and tends to be, you know, a little bit more tasty than just straw alone. So it has been really useful. So at the minute, I do sound like a broken record, but that probably is one of the ones that I am suggesting the most. But what's just started to creep up as well is people are very definitely beginning to worry about their older horses and ponies that are losing their teeth. So alpha beets and grass pellets are definitely up there as well at the minute.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you on that one. I think
Yeah.
those two, it's either or at the moment. But good doers, it's Meadow Light. Poor doers, it's Alpha Beat. So
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the last questions for you, Katie, is my horse looks bloated but isn't in poor condition. Could this be the hay causing this?
Yeah, I think we had a couple of questions about sort of that bloating look when I looked earlier. Firstly, I think it's really important to say that there are lots of reasons why a horse might look a bit bloated. So don't disregard and other signs. It could be something a bit more sinister going on. So if your horse is showing any other sort of signs of concern, so lack of appetite, or if they seem uncomfortable at all, do have a chat with your vet, because it could be something else. Also, general management, making sure you've got a good parasite control program in place as well. So I'd always recommend working with a SQP here, or suitably qualified person under the AMTRA scheme, who will be able to advise in more detail about the sort of precautions and methods you can take here. But when it comes to the nutrition side of things, generally speaking, horses don't hold fat around their abdomen or around their belly. We do have quite a good body condition scoring guidelines on our website, which we can send through to you all, just to help you assess actually the areas where your horse is holding their fat or holding their weight. But generally, as I said, around their belly, it doesn't tend to be fat around there. So these kind of hay bellies may sometimes occur if the horse is being fed a poorer quality forage, so one with more of that indigestible fibre that I spoke about. Now, although these can be really useful for good doers, they can sometimes cause that hay belly. As long as there's no other issues going on, it's not necessarily a cause for concern. It is a perfectly normal shape that your horse might be if they are being fed on one of these sort of forage types. But as I said, do monitor them, make sure there's no other issues going on. For those who are not sort of overweight and you do have a poorer quality forage, then using a digestive aid supplement just to help with the breakdown of that fibre can be helpful if you're not able to change to a more sort of digestible or softer forage supply. And some general tips would be just supporting gut health, keeping them moving, and ensuring that they're drinking enough water as well. But as I said, any ongoing concerns, then do have a chat to your vet. Fantastic. So I hope that's answered your question, who was sort of concerned about that. And Tracey, I think just one final question for you. I don't think we've had any more come in on the chat or the Q&A that I can see. But somebody's asked, how can I ensure my horse is having enough fibre as well as the correct balance of vitamins and minerals? I know you did touch on this in your brilliant slides with our ration programme, but do you want to just elaborate any more there?
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully we've definitely covered the having enough fibre and ways we can modify what we're feeding to maximise the fibre or forage intake. Forage and fibre are essentially the same thing, same terms we might use interchangeably. But when it comes to the correct balance of vitamins and minerals, you know, where you can get that from is either a fortified feed fed at the recommended quantity, a balancer, or a vitamin and mineral supplement. So they're your main choices of providing those, or obviously, you know, maybe even a lick as well out in the paddock. With a feed that's got vitamins and minerals added to it, it is only going to provide that balanced diet if it's fed at the manufacturer's recommendations. And this is one area we tend to see people going kind of wrong or astray, in that they'll be feeding a handful of something that's got vitamins and minerals in it and think they're giving everything that their horse needs. And as you saw from those slides I showed earlier, the more that we're restricting kind of the forage or feeding more straw or soaking more hay, the further away that we're going to be from those ideals. So if you've got a good doer, then it's definitely going to be the case of looking at something like a feed balancer, because that's going to give you your quality protein as well as your vitamins and minerals. Or if you prefer not to use one of those, you can use a vitamin and mineral supplement and an amino acid supplement as well as another kind of alternative. If your horse is obviously less of a good doer, then you're probably going to be able to feed the recommended amount of a fortified feed, in which case you will be fine, is the advice there. Just again, the other thing to bear in mind then is that it's appropriate for that individual's workload. So if they are working kind of hard, for example, then you want to make sure that you're feeding a performance type product that's going to meet their needs rather than a leisure horse product like a high fibre cube, for example.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tracey. That's a great answer then. Hopefully that helps everybody. I think we haven't had any additional questions come in on the chat and the Q&A. Hopefully we've been able to answer them. I know most of you submitted questions beforehand as well. So I think we'll bring this to a close now, but if you do have any further questions, please do get in touch. The feed line details should still be on your screen now. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.